The library embodies the most remarkable and frustrating paradox. It is the most intensively studied body of text ever found. It is the basis on which the modern field of Assyriology has been built. We know an incredible amount of detail from the books, i.e. clay tablets, found in the library, but the library itself has resisted interpretation. Or at least people have speculated, but we haven't had a lot of evidence to work with to really get to the bottom of what it really was. I'm afraid there's not much to see, but it is an important monument. It's obviously one of the most important discoveries from ancient Iraq, and I would argue in world archaeology. Now, when I arrived at the museum as a bright-eyed young curator, I was presented with an idea of the library. So imagine 612 BC, you're in the palace at Nineveh, and the Medes, possibly also the Babylonians, have besieged the city. They've broken in, they stormed through the palace, they're busy slaughtering anybody who can't run out the way fast enough. They're taking everything made of gold or whatever, and they're burning the place down, and everybody is fleeing as fast as they can. In a room off one of the courtyards is the library of Ashurbanipal. I would like to thank Donald Sanders and Learning Sites for sharing this a work in progress, a visualization of what it might have looked like. So the bookshelves burned, tablets crash to the floor and smash. The rest of the building collapses around it, covers it over, and there it remains until 2,500 years later, a Victorian explorer hires a team of workers to dig them up and carry them off to London. It therefore embodies three miracles at once. Miracle one, Ashurbanipal had the vision to collect a copy of every book that existed at the time, kind of modern, an ancient version of the British Library, or Alexandria, pick your parallel. Second, we had the good fortune that the library burnt down. Now, normally, burning down a library is a bit bad, but when your books are made of clay, it makes them stronger. And yes, they're broken into pieces, but they're trapped among the debris, so that with enough time and patience, we can stick them back together to make complete tablets and almost put them back on the shelves. Fantastic. And then the third miracle was that this happened to be the first thing that was found in the modern attempt to rediscover Assyria. So it was the perfect discovery, and we made it. It's a great story. The question is it true? And over the next few minutes, I'm going to present you with some of the evidence that we have and present you with my idea of what I think the best reconstruction of what the library is. Sorry for the phrasing. So let's start with what we do know. So Ashurbanipal is real. He's king of Assyria in the 7th century BC. In his texts and his iconography, he likes to present himself as a scribe. As scribe and king of the world, he is able to assemble an enormous quantity of cuneiform texts in his palace, in his capital at Nineveh, nowadays within the city limits of Mosul. This was excavated in a series of expeditions between around 1850 to the 1930s on behalf of the British Museum, and a total of more than 32,000 fragments were recovered. This is uncontroversial. So it has been the task of my predecessors over the years to try and present an interpretation of what the library was. In 2018, we had an exhibition about Ashurbanipal, and so that task then fell to me. So we invite you in, you must learn about this fantastic library. How do I explain what it was? Well, I had a good hard think about things, and seductive as the story I was told is, I wasn't comfortable telling it because even 2018, I knew enough to suspect that it might not be entirely true. So what I came up with was this. People seemed quite happy. I'm quite relieved and pleased by that. It was the wall, we called it, a 5-meter expanse of tablets, more or less completely reconstructed tablets. I wanted to at least convey what we did know about it. So it conveyed a sense of scale and of order. And I put on, just about see here, 2-word labels on each of the sections to give you an idea of the kind of books that are in the collection. You could see what the tablets looked like. You could see that they were broken, and some of them still aren't quite complete, so you could understand the state of knowledge. But essentially, that was more or less all we had to say about the library. We had, of course, much more detailed descriptions of individual tablets at the side, but the library itself, we didn't really have much to say about. Over the last 5 years, we have learned, I think, more than in the previous century, so we could actually say a lot more were we to hold that exhibition now. One of the reasons we struggle is because there's just so much of it, and it's so complex. So the late Professor Borger articulated this quite well when he pointed out that it's really rather frustrating when you're trying to reconstruct a text, and you've only got part of it, and you know that just out of reach in these trays, somewhere is the missing bits that you really need, and there's really rather a lot of trays. That is frustrating for all of us. So imagine as a visitor, you come along to the exhibition and you say, right, Taylor, what was the library? What you're really asking is a series of smaller questions, like, okay, where was this library? What's in it? How many of them were there? Very reasonable question. I've heard some people say libraries, some people say library. Which is it? Is it even a library at all? And was it even Ashurbanipal? Some people have challenged that. Unfortunately, although he's not a modest man, Ashurbanipal never described his library. He never even mentions it once. So we have no ancient accounts of what the library was. Therefore, we have to ask a parallel set of questions based on the library as we know it, the material that was excavated in that series of campaigns, and try and work backwards to try and work out what it might have been originally. Fortunately, in 2019, we learned that we had been awarded funding for a joint project with Enrique Jimenez at the University of Munich, where we would be able to analyze the library in detail and come up with a solid base of evidence on which to found a new set of interpretations. And it's largely this that I'd like to talk about today. So for convenience, we can break down the evidence that's available into 4 categories. Some of it is definitely about the library. Some of it looks like it is, but might not be. Some of it is contemporary with Ashurbanipal, and some of it is later. And we have each combination. We'll look at each in turn. And we'll start with the archaeology, which should be the most helpful thing. We know that these 32,000 or so tablets were found on the mound of Kiunjik in 4 places. So there's a large discovery in this palace. A few years later, another large discovery up there, and in between, some more tablets came from those 2 locations. And unfortunately, due to the way that finds were handled, largely at the museum, we are no longer able to say in many cases exactly which one of those any individual tablet came from. Now, when you read an account of the library, you will almost certainly come across this. So this is the Southwest Palace, that first discovery. And there's a little room off this courtyard, pictured in the wonderful, very prompt publication about it, and this famous passage, which you've probably read 100 times, where Layard recounts a story that was told to him by his foreman. So Layard says in his book that he'd gone off to visit another site, as he tended to do, and then when he came back on this occasion, his foreman, Toma, very excitedly told him about this remarkable discovery, and they found this room with tablets, knee-deep. Some of them were complete, but most of them were broken into fragments. Okay. More or less immediately, that became labeled a library. So we have here a sketch map made by Layard, who was running the expedition at the time. And you can see at the bottom, he's added extra letters for rooms that haven't quite made it onto the sketch yet. And the one that interests us is the one W, library. So it's a library on the basis of it's a room with lots of books in it. Nothing much more sophisticated than that. In the years that followed, cuneiformists of the time, there weren't many of them, but they were able to explain to him that, yes, they do indeed contain scholarly types of text. So yes, the interpretation as a library seems quite good. And they were very quickly able to recognize that the name Ashurbanipal occurs on many of them. So pretty soon, actually, the idea that this is the library of Ashurbanipal became embedded in the scholarly consciousness. All good so far. So here we have that room again, and the one next to it where similar remains were found. But it's a little more complicated because tablets were also found slightly more widely than that, even at the time. And then a generation later, when George Smith, having discovered the flood tablet and going back to Iraq to find the missing bits of his tablet, dug more widely and found more. And crucially, he discovered tablets in this long room here. And he noticed that not only were there pieces of the same kinds of tablet, but sometimes he could join fragments of the same tablet that somehow ended up in these two different rooms. And the problem there was there's no doorway connecting the two rooms. And so he turned to the idea that there was somehow a second story, and that as the palace collapsed, some of them fell this side of the wall, some of the bits fell on the other side of the wall. Makes a lot of sense, but in the years since then, we have learned a lot more about Assyrian palaces, and it's not clear that there was a second story, and even if there were a second story, the wall is probably following the same line as the lower story, so that doesn't seem like a great explanation, and it's been pointed out that actually the rooms where they were found seem to be one of the palace bathrooms, which is not where you expect your tablets to be found. So this is rather awkward. And indeed, a few years later, when Rassam leads some excavations, they're finding tablets in quite a few locations. And there was an idea put forward that, some of the tablets were kicked as people flee the flames and run out the door, and that's how they sort of made their way along the corridor. But that doesn't really, I think, adequately explain it. I think this man had the right idea. So this is Karl Betzold. He was hired at the end of the 19th century to produce a catalogue of the collection. So he worked through the entire collection. He knew it very, very well firsthand. And what he has to say has to be taken seriously. He pointed out a couple of things, one of which there aren't that many complete tablets anymore. And he supposed that what had happened was that these tablets were deliberately broken and scattered around. And I think that is the closest our predecessors came to the truth. And Andrew George, sitting here, has recently published a very good article assembling the evidence for this, and I think basically this argument is correct. So we now know, thanks I think to Julian Reed sitting somewhere, where's Julian? Oh, he's in the audience, there he is, pointed out that the reliefs decorating the walls of the palaces had been damaged in very careful, targeted ways. So it's fairly clear, I think, that there was a period where the palace was being looted before it was burnt, and combined with this evidence, I think we can see that there's processing. So the big point to take away from this is that the location we find the tablets is not where Ashurbanipal would have put them. So we can't say that this is Ashurbanipal's library room, and it also means that we can't then enter really into the question of library or libraries. And I think you can come to the same conclusion based on the tablets. So having found fragments over the last 170 years, people have tried to stick them back together again, and many tablets are reconstructed from numerous pieces. So we come back to our first set of questions. You come to me as a visitor to say, how many books are in the library? And I go, well, it's a bit difficult. I don't know. I'm going to have to stick the bits together before I can really tell you. So we do some maths. So we work backwards. Well, what we've got is about 32,000 fragments. 6,000 of them have been glued back together already, so we can take those off. And about 6,000 are some other kind of tablet that won't join these, so we can put those to one side. That leaves us with, say, 20,000 pieces to think about. If we take people's estimates of how many tablets there were, they range from about 2,000 to 5,000 tablets in total people have estimated based on what we know. So if we take the best case scenario, 5,000, that means there's still at least 15,000 pieces we have to put back together. So we're only a quarter of the way through the project. we keep records for joins, and I can tell you that the average historical rate for joining bits together is 35 a year. And if you think 15,000 at 35 a year, I will be able to answer your very reasonable question, I'd be delighted to do so, in approximately 400 years' time. So I hope you'll bear with me in the meantime. I'm patient, but not that patient. Fortunately, there is a project at Munich which has accelerated the process enormously. So in the last, I don't know, good 15 or so years, we've spent a lot of time documenting the library. So we now have photographs of all of the fragments, so you no longer have to be frustrated that somewhere in a drawer is the bit you want. All of the bits are in this digital resource. And together with Munich, we've gathered together transliterations for all of these things, so you can search it. And there's ever increasing detailed cataloging. So what kind of text is it? Has it been published? Yes or no? Things like that. So we can start to work with it. And the result of Munich's work is that the rate at which pieces are going back together is now 10 times what it historically has been, which means that I can offer you in the very reasonable 42 years' time an answer to your question. Okay. We'll come back to Smith. So Smith, I imagine you are familiar, is the man who's so excited at finding a cuneiform equivalent to the biblical flood story that he took all his clothes off and ran around the room, or so the story goes, or at least he undressed, whatever that means to Victorians. He was employed by the museum to work through all of these fragments and stick them back together again, because I think the trustees didn't want to assign numbers to bits where you put two together, and now I would really like to give that one number. That's a bit of a nuisance. They left them unnumbered until he could put the pieces back together, and then we'll give a number to the conglomerate. So he has to be taken very seriously because he's worked firsthand with all of these pieces. And he points out, in the 19th century, that having examined this collection, he's pretty confident that not one half of it has been taken to London, or brought home, as he would put it. To give you an idea of what that means, this is the flood tablet as we display it, which is a little bit less than what the tablet originally was. And to give you an idea, here's a copy, a duplicate of that same tablet, pieced together from fragments by Smith. And you can see it's more or less complete. There's a few gaps. Now, in the exhibition, next to that wall of tablets, on the right-hand side, I had a little table case, and I pulled out and displayed the best preserved copies of each of the 12 chapters of the Gilgamesh story. And some of them, like this, are more or less complete. Many of them are only half complete, and some of them are just little bits, and they're the best preserved examples. And you can repeat this exercise for many different kinds of text. So, despite the fact that we now have twice as many tablets as George Smith had, what he said is still true. We have less than half of the material. This is very bad news for two sets of people. One, it's bad for the museum. So I've had a designer look me dead in the eye and say, haven't you got one that isn't broken? Sorry, there will never be the answer yes to that question. It's bad news for scholars in the short term, hoping to reconstruct these tablets, because try as you might, you'll end up with half a tablet if you're lucky. But it is very good news in the long term, isn't it? Because what that must mean is that at least half of that library is still in the ground. And with proper scientific excavations, we will learn a lot, not just about that material, but probably also about the material excavated in the 19th century. So there's a lot still to come out of the library in the future. All right. Story time. These are slightly contentious. We won't spend too long on it, but there are a few tablets found not in Nineveh, not in Assyria, but down in Babylonia. And they purport to be copies of letters sent between the king of Assyria, and in some cases at least it's definitely Ashurbanipal, and the Babylonians. And he's saying things like, copy tablets for me and send them for my collection. This kind of thing. There is a big discussion about whether these are actually copies of real letters or not. I won't get stuck in that, but what I would say is, I think it is significant that for centuries after Assyria is politically gone, it doesn't come back, Assyria is off the map, Babylonians have a tradition of telling stories about an Assyrian king, Ashurbanipal, collecting tablets. Sort of rings a little bit too true for it to be complete fantasy for me. There is a slight novelty here. This was one of the pieces newly discovered by Munich and published recently by Fraser in a book. And it's a similar kind of letter, and it's interesting because it's very clearly Ashurbanipal we're talking about, and he says this intriguing thing about, he's set a task for the Babylonians. He wrote to them thus: all of the scribal learning, presumably copy and centeny or something like that. So it's interesting that in antiquity there's an idea that this collection is a comprehensive one. It's a little contentious, so let's move on. We're on much firmer ground when it comes to these tablets. So there's a group of about half a dozen or so tablets found at Nineveh amongst the library tablets. They appear to be lists of tablets and writing boards arriving at Nineveh for the royal library. And the timing of their arrival seems to be significant. They turn up just after the end of the civil war. The Assyrians win, they capture Babylon, and then this huge number of tablets arrive in Nineveh. And if you think back to what I said a couple of minutes ago, people estimate maybe 2,000 to 5,000 tablets for the library as a whole. If 2,000 have come from this one moment, that's quite a high percentage of the library. If that's true, we ought to be able to find them. But the problem with the Babylonian tablets is that we don't have quite enough of them. So if you count the number of pieces in Babylonian handwriting, it's only about a seventh. It's only about 15%, and it should be at least 40 to 100% of the material. So something's missing. I've put on the right an excerpt of one of these tablets to give you an idea of what kind of thing they say. So we have one tablet here from so-and-so, the scribe of the king of Babylon, and two down here. Something to note is that these are remarkably low numbers. So any self-respecting scribe is going to have dozens or maybe even hundreds of tablets in his collection. But yet they're only sending one or two. So what we cannot picture is the victorious Assyrian army surging into the city, kicking the door down of the scribe's house, scooping the shelf of tablets into a basket and sending it off to Nineveh. It's a much more selective process somehow. So we should be able to find some of these tablets since there are so many of them. If you look through the tablets, you can find examples where it's not Ashurbanipal's name written on them. It's Joe Smith, Fred Bloggs, somebody like that. And we have a few hundred, which is quite a lot. And when we look at how many of each we have for each of these ordinary scribes, you see it's a little bit like the records, isn't it? It's 1, 1, 1, 2, 1, 1, 5. Not many. You don't have 50, 100, anything like that. It's very strangely selective. And it's the same for the Babylonians. 1, 1, 1. Okay, 4, 1, 1, 1. So again, this is not the result of taking in a scribe's entire collection. It's much more selective. It looks very much like what we saw in the acquisition records. So you think maybe these are the tablets mentioned in the records. But if you check the names in the lists and the names on the tablets, there's no match. There's not a single example of one found in the other. But it looks to be the result of the same process. And indeed, to date, nobody's been able to identify a single tablet out of those 2,500 in the collection. Until now. So this is an entry from one of those lists. It says 1 dub, 1 tablet, Piori, which should be the name of a book. Except nobody has been able to work out what on earth Piori is. And that's because it isn't, because what it actually says is Kitabri, which is a reference to a rare text called Shuma Kitabru. Great. So what we then do is we need to look for a copy of that in the library in Babylonian handwriting. Have we got one? Yes, we do. We have half, because it's the library, but yes, we do have one. We have precisely one. So that may well be the copy of this book sent to Nineveh by this man, Applier, the exorcist from Nippur. We can't confirm it because he hasn't written his name on the tablet. But there's one. We know a lot more when it comes to tablets with Ashurbanipal's name on them. So coming back to Karl Betzold, one of his other important observations was that when you look at the tablets, almost every tablet with import, what he means is almost every more or less completely preserved tablet bears in its colophon, and we're going to use colophon a lot, so I'll explain what we mean by that. It's a little note at the end of the tablet which explains something about the circumstances of the tablet's production. So in many cases, it will say tablet of Mr. So-and-so, copy of an original from maybe the date, something like that. In this case, this is just Ashurbanipal's name and titles. So what he's saying is when you have a complete tablet, it's got Ashurbanipal's book plate on it, if you like. 120 years later, that is still true. And I know that because for the exhibition, in order to create that wall, I went through the collection tray by tray and pulled out all of the tablets that are more or less completely preserved or reconstructed, put them on the table, there they are, and I looked at the colophons, the scribal note at the end, to say, do they have Ashurbanipal's name on? And almost every single one does. It's a range of different types of tablet, range of different types of text, so I think we are justified in inferring from that that the majority of the material there really does come from Ashurbanipal's library. It's not contaminated from anywhere. So that's quite interesting. Let's dig a little deeper. Normally, out in the cuneiform world, colophons are unique because it's a record of a particular moment in time when a scribe has copied one tablet onto another. So they don't duplicate. In Ashurbanipal's library, they do. You get basically verbatim the same text again and again and again on many, many tablets, which indicates that something else is happening there. But despite that, we don't just have one book plate. It's not to stamp anything that comes through the door, stamp, stamp, stamp. We have about 30 of these things. And if you look at the kinds of book that these plates are put on, you get a slightly confusing picture. You can see that some of them are very common, some of them are less common, some of them are rare only once, some of them belong to a particular type of book, some just a specific book in itself, others are general, some of them do the same job as another one, and it looks like a mess. And it can't be a mess because that doesn't make sense. So I would like to present a possible reconstruction of the scheme. I argue that there is chronological and intellectual depth to the library. So we start off, Ashurbanipal, we know, is collecting tablets before he becomes king. So I think he has one of those, this is his legacy collection when he's prince. Then when he becomes king, he starts to copy some tablets for the library, we'll put those aside for the moment, and he has a palace collection. And after he's settled in and he's done all of the urgent business of becoming a king, he has it's a slightly difficult time, you have a few tasks you need to do before you worry about the colophons. He comes up with a kind of book plate befitting the scribe, the scholar emperor, the king of the world. And then he sits with that for a bit, and then he thinks, actually, no, I'm going to do something slightly different. He comes up with a more sophisticated system. So let's try and flesh that out a bit. So we start, fortunately, with what was labeled colophon A. It's this one-liner, and it just says king's name and his titles. And this is unique amongst these 30 colophons in all sorts of ways. So it's written on the tablet after the clay has dried, which is very unusual and very uncomfortable. It's not something any sensible scribe would plan to do. We also have a few examples in ink, which is, again, incredibly rare. It's not great for cuneiform. Nobody would plan to do this if you had the choice. So it looks like a secondary moment of inscription. When they wrote those tablets, they weren't intended for the library. And we can see this also in the placement. So here's an example. There are quite a few of these where that wasn't me, where the scribe has obviously left, he has plenty of space, but then this thing is just stuck around the corner on the edge. So when they wrote that tablet, they had no idea that this text was going to be written on it. So it's a later thing, it's a second moment in time. Unless you've studied cuneiform, you may perhaps not notice this, but the way the signs are written, the type of handwriting is not the same type of handwriting as the main text. It's a specific type that they use to write on stone. And this gives us a clue to what's really going on here, in that it looks like just a palace property label. So you see this kind of text on the reliefs, on objects within the palace. What it means is this belongs to the palace, don't take it away, and if you take it away, we know where it's come from. It seems to be just essentially that. Okay, great, that's I would argue, a plausible idea, but then we have these. So we have about 300 in this incredibly unusual secondary idea where you press it in when the clay is dry. But we have this rather annoying group of 17 where they've clearly planned for it and they've written it on while the clay's wet. You think that might blow the idea out the water, but I would say it doesn't. I would say it's the opposite. What that tells you is that they're in the habit, they're producing text all the time, and what we've got is that moment in time after he's just become king. So they know they're going to write that one-liner bookplate on it, but rather than wait for the clay to dry and force it in, they've just done it like that. So this is the moment between becoming a king and having the time to relax and think about it. And then when he's had a little bit of time to think about it, he comes up with this, which is a much more florid example. This is him sort of relaxing, sort of enjoying his kingship, leaning into it a little bit. And it has three components. And this second colophon, fortunately called B, this is pure coincidence, but it's brilliant. I've highlighted in yellow the bits that are very, very unusual, that distinguish it from the other 28, 29 colophons. And there's quite a lot of it. So he tells you not just that he's the king, but he's the son of the king and the grandson of the king. So what he's doing is establishing his legitimacy as king. And he even tells you at the bottom that when he puts his tablet in the palace, it's for his royal consultation, which the other ones later never bother to do. He just consults them later. But he does it in a very royal way in this colophon. That doesn't make a lot of sense if we think about it, because we have, from the benefit of hindsight, we know that he reigned a very long time and the empire reached its height under him. You think, why would he do this? You have to think about it in his terms. So he comes to the throne after a very turbulent period of Assyrian history, and he would not have taken for granted that he would take the throne unopposed. There was a very messy period of history immediately before him. So he would assume that he had the right to it, but not necessarily that nobody was going to try and take that from him. Second thing, he has this interesting clause telling you where his originals are coming from. He's telling you that it's tablets and writing boards from Assyria and Babylonia. What he's saying is all types of tablet from across his empire are coming in, and he's collating them all into a master copy, which is very odd. Normally in this kind of manuscript culture, you copy from one original to one new tablet. But here in the library, because he has so many coming in, he's sort of condensing them all down to a single copy. And we have to take that seriously because we do have notes on the tablets that say things like copy of a writing board from Babylon, a tablet from Ashur, something like that, but never on a tablet with this bookplate. You have it on the other colophon, sure, but not on this one. So that it is actually meaningful content. To give you an example of the kind of thing that must be happening, one of the other colophons, this one is G, it's attached to a list of drugs, medicinal drugs. It tells you that Ashurbanipal had all of these texts, and he thought that actually they weren't particularly well arranged, they were sort of lumped, and perhaps he could do a little bit better at ordering the drugs in this list. So he did it. So there's editorial activity happening. And again, this relates to reality. So the people who've studied this text confirm that, yes, the manuscripts with his bookplate on from his library are different from the other ones. So this editorial activity took place. And that's the kind of thing he must be talking about with this kind of clause. So it's a living library. It's not a collection of loot. They're actually doing something with the tablets. And the bit I like rather a lot is that he has a quality control clause. He says that the copies, quite a complex procedure, the quality has been approved by the Assembly of Experts. Okay, great. Who exactly are the Assembly of Experts? Well, it's not really a body. And I suspect it doesn't mean much more than sort of the scholars present at court. It's something that he doesn't otherwise talk about. And I think it belongs together with an observation made by Christopher Jones, who was looking at letters from Assyria at this time. And he noticed that if you look at who's writing to who and the kind of influence that people have, that under Ashurbanipal's father, scribes, scholars, take on immense importance for access to the king. They seem to control the king in some way. Ashurbanipal slowly extricates from that and takes the power for himself. So it makes perfect sense that early in his reign, the experts are playing a role. He inherited that, couldn't do much about it. But as his reign extends, he doesn't replace people when they retire and things like that. And so this is the mature phase. So now he doesn't have to tell you who his father was, who his grandfather was, just I am Ashurbanipal. That's enough. And he doesn't tell you about the assembly of scholars signing his work off. What he tells you is that he's uniquely gifted because he has this magical connection with the gods. Nobody before me was quite this great. So you can see the ideology, I was going to say propaganda, the concept behind it is completely different. Okay, I would argue that's a plausible scheme, but can we produce evidence to back it up? And yes, this gets a little bit technical. Don't worry about the details. Try and look at the trends. So there are, broadly speaking, two types of handwriting in the library. There is a slightly old-fashioned version, which is type B, and a more modern version, which is type A. And if you line your colophons up in chronological order, according to this proposed scheme, you notice that the proportion of modern handwriting increases over time, which is exactly what you'd expect to see. Very good. Some tablets have these funny holes that we call firing holes. We don't know quite what they do, but they occur on scholarly tablets from time to time. And again, if you line your colophons up in chronological order, the proportion increases. So again, there's a nice pattern. How do we explain it? A little bit less clear, but there is an analogy. So the king's right. Wow, me either. Ashurbanipal speaks from the grave. All right, so the Assyrian kings were in the habit of depositing these huge cylinders and prisms, listing all the great things they did. Very rarely will you find these firing holes on an object like that, except under Ashurbanipal. So they're connected somehow with Ashurbanipal. And Stefania Iridora has pointed out that it's not just any moment in Ashurbanipal. It comes from a particular point in the middle of his reign when you get lots of these which have the holes put in them. And that matches quite nicely with the development of the colophons. And I think what he's doing really, he's making them look like a scholarly product, a kind of literary product. And people who have studied the phraseology of the text say it's quite a florid literary style. So it sort of hangs together. And we can approach it from a completely different direction as well. So we also had a project on reconstructing a medical handbook called the Medical Encyclopedia. And I asked the project curators to have a look at the colophons. What bookplate did he put on the end of that text? And there are basically two. It's a little bit more nuanced, but for present purposes, there's two. So most of them, as you might expect, have the medical one. 4 of them, rather annoyingly, have this other one. So why on earth, if there's a medical colophon, would you put a different one on? And why that one and not these other very popular ones? Well, under this scheme, it makes sense, because the ones with this colophon have that colophon because that one hadn't been invented yet. Everything at that point has that on it. So of course they have that. Then why do these have this one? Well, they stopped writing this one because they had this new scheme, and under the new scheme, there is differentiation, and here's a special medical one, so of course you put the medical one on. So it actually makes sense as a distribution. So I'm quite happy with that. Or look at this. So these are omen texts. They're predicting the future. Don't worry about how or why. They are duplicates, even down to the arrangement of the text on the surface, where the gaps are, okay? And when you look at the text, again, don't worry about what the text says, the scribe has noted in each of these three cases, in the different colors, on both tablets, that at that point in the text, the original that he's copying from is broken. And both of these manuscripts are copying from an original that was broken in exactly the same place in those 3 lines, which tells you that these 2 tablets are either copies of an original that we no longer have, possible, or one is a copy of another, and I think that's what it was. And I think that also fits into the colophon scheme. So A is this legacy set. This is him as a prince. And D is the mature phase, when he's become king and he's filling his shoes. And there is a nice little confirmation for me of this. If you look at library tablets, they have specific features. And one of them is that they have this very sharp edge separating the top from the surface. And it's present in this one with D, which is what you would expect, mature colophon, and it's absent from the one that was written while he was a prince. So I think that's a nice confirmation of what's happening and why there's a direct copy of the older tablet. That makes sense to me. So I think what we're seeing here is a kind of growing personal collection. He moves into the palace, he puts his name on it, he's very happy to be king. As he becomes king in the beginning of his reign, there's this enormous flow of material to his personal collection, partly because he's king and partly because people are, trying to gain favor. They copy the ones that they think are okay, and if there's something that they think needs a little bit of work, maybe the order's not quite what they want, they edit it. They're editing, for example, the medical text, and they come up with a sophisticated system. So I think you have in that mature phase a concept of a library. It's not just, I have lots of books. He has a concept of the thing as a whole, I would argue. All right, that's a lot of information. Before I close, just 2 last points. So what I've sketched for you is an idea that the library, you can see it's not just a moment in time. It's not the period after they defeat Babylon and they just grab these things and put them in the storeroom and forget about them. It's a library that has length, it has life. They're editing and working with the material. It's not just a copy for a copy's sake and put it on the file because you're paid to just copy the text and don't think about it. They're working with it. They're using it. There is thought behind the different parts of the library, I think. You can see the personality and the circumstances of the king himself shaping this. And Sophie Cohen, the PhD student in Munich, has made a number of arguments which actually, in my view, very convincingly outline the role of the chief scribe as well. So he's the guy who comes up with the specific type of handwriting that they use in this shaping of the tablet, and actually some of the wording of the colophons, that seems to come from him. So you can see real people reacting to real-world circumstances influencing why the library takes the shape that it does. Okay, so last slide, two last slides. Looking forward, I've learned a lot about the library, but we are about to learn a whole lot more. One is that there are excavations run by the University of Bologna, a little bit up the site in Nineveh, so not at the palace, they're not the library, but they found quite a lot of Assyrian tablets. This one is published, so we'll have a little look at this one. So it belongs to somebody who is a very high-ranking person at the court of the last king of Assyria. And there are other tablets of this sort, and there's some remarkable tablets that you wouldn't expect to find. And what they show us is two things. One, the circulation of material in Assyria itself. So they're not just importing from Babylonia, there's local circulation. But also it tells you that this cuneiform learning that is invisible in the library, because everything just has Ashurbanipal's name on it. There's no library tablets that say Seen Sharyushkan. But outside of the library, you can tell that cuneiform literature and learning is flourishing right down to the very end of the city and Assyrian culture. So that will be a very important group of tablets soon. And then the last one is that sitting over there is a postdoctoral researcher who is spending 2 years at the museum studying the clays of the tablets. So we've looked at the handwriting, we looked at the shaping, we looked at the text and the colophon. Something that we've been trying for years to do but never quite been able to do until now is to study the clay itself. And you don't have to be a petrographer to tell that some of those are similar and some of those are very, very different. And what you can do, if you can group and separate tablets, you can start to understand perhaps where some of these tablets are coming from, and which ones belong with which other ones, which might tell you all sorts of things, like where this scribe was trained, or might tell you, which tablets are produced by a particular scribe, if you're lucky. Things like when you combine it with the other information that we have, we are going to learn a lot from the clays. The initial results are very promising. I won't talk about that now. We can maybe bother Mathilde later. But I think the point is that we've learned a huge amount over the last 5 years, but this is really only the beginning of our understanding of the library. So I presented what I hope is at least plausible, hopefully also convincing, an idea of a library that's alive, actually is a library, and is a meaningful collection of texts. But I think we will learn an awful lot more about it in the years to come. So thank you very much for your attention.